very clear that Norm had enormous influence on many of us, and myself in particular, enormous intellect, as we've heard, but also great humanity. And certainly back 27 years ago when I first met him as a young registrar, doing research, he took me to one side and he really went through my research, although he didn't know me at all. And so he's a great man, and I was honoured last year to be able to get him involved in a written debate with Paul Abrams, which you've all seen, and which Jerry is quoted from in the journal that Jerry set up. And that really was, I think, a great thing to have in there. And you saw the comments about cooking and so on, which came out in the written word. So it was fantastic. It was great, the interaction I had with him from the journal, because I was always in contact with him and he was always giving ideas about papers and so on. So he's had a major impact in my role in the journal as well. Now, without more ado, I'd like to move on. I think we've heard some fantastic talks so far. And we had, obviously, as Werner emphasized, we're talking about in the standardization, symptoms, findings, signs, and investigations. And we shouldn't really get that confused, because ultimately what we're talking about here is a symptom complex, and we know, as Werner mentioned, that there's relatively poor correlation often with urodynamic findings, but it's all under the influence of the brain. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Marcus Drake, who is at the Bristol Urological Institute, and as you know him, he's been involved in so many different areas, both clinical and particularly research, both clinical research and pharmacology research. And very much looking forward to your take on this, Marcus, on the upper tract and the way in which the upper tract in terms of the brain controls the lower problems.
Thank you very much indeed, and it is an honour. Norm was clearly a great man, and I hope his soul will approve of what I hope will be some thoughts worth sharing. It seems a bit of an odd title, doesn't it? Do we need a brain to get an overactive bladder? But in fact, it's quite clear that there's fundamental interaction between brain and bladder. And probably the most important aspects of brain function of relevance here have to be the fact that the brain is the seat of our consciousness, the fact that it is the seat of where we make our decisions, our volitional actions. It's also the seat of personality, and hence profoundly affects bother and quality of life. But really it's the top two, the consciousness and the volition, I'd like to focus on. First of all, it's the consciousness of an intrusive urinary sensation that really makes this condition important in our clinical practice. It's also the volitional control over our lower urinary tract that in fact means that we don't have a problem, most of us, with our lower urinary tract most of the time. So when it comes to consciousness, this is clearly a brain function. And critical to consciousness is what we perceive, what we allow in terms of sensory information, which represents our awareness of environment. And in effect, perception is where subconscious sensory information becomes a genuine sensation. And that is different from afferent traffic, because we are conscious of that sensation. So perception is all about attention, because when you think about the number of stimuli competing for our individual attention, it is absolutely enormous. My little toe, for example, at the moment, is being pressed on by my shoe. But I'm not giving that a whole lot of attention. And there are so many stimuli like that that we are completely disregarding all the time. We attend to only one thing at any one time, and the rest we just disregard unless it clamours for our attention. Now, what we have to recognise is that the substrate for our sensations is the sensory information, the afferents. And when you reflect on the urinary tract, we're conscious that the urothelium is next to afferent nerves. Those afferent nerves are stimulated and generate afferent traffic, sensory information that goes up to the periaqueductal gray, but throughout all that, it is subconscious. And that is the bottom-up processing. But what can happen is suddenly it leaps to the forefront. And the best example of this would be a sudden noise. You can't ignore that. The stimulus has driven you. A sudden loud noise, you will pay attention to it, whether you like it or not. So that is called bottom-up processing. And it is where the stimulus is responsible for drawing our attention. And clearly that will happen if our lower urinary tract becomes inflamed, for example. But then there's the absolutely critical brain elements, the top-down processing. We learn, we expect, we have memories, we get frightened. For example, frightened that we might leak. And that will very much alter the propensity for an individual stimulus to make it to our attention. And therefore, the endogenous attention, where we choose to concentrate, is fundamental, again, in our appreciation of the overactive bladder. We can focus our attention like holding a conversation in a crowded room. We can still hear who we're talking to despite a lot of other noise. So with our fundamental clinical presentation of urgency, incontinence, frequency, nocturia, what we're really dealing with is where that subconscious, periaqueductal grey monitored sensory traffic leaps into the consciousness and overcomes what really should be the priority for our attention. Then it becomes intrusive urinary sensation. So our brain function is essential to the concept of overactive bladder. And it results in inappropriate precedence given to lower urinary tract sensory information. And the interaction between the endogenous response, what frightens our OAB patients, and the stimulus-driven, what comes up from down below, is a profound interaction which we simply don't understand as yet. So when we move away from sensation, we're talking about movement, and volition, free will, is what we are all about. As humans, we're proud we make our decisions on what we are going to do. So we determine our actions, and the thing that we determine to do receives all attention, everything else becoming subordinate. And let's be frank, the lower urinary tract is pretty much subordinate all the time, which means that automatically our brain is telling our lower urinary tract, you behave yourself, detrusor, stay calm, urethra, stay contracted, then everything is fine. Because we have to store, we don't want to be doing that outside our volition. And then when we want to pass urine, that small proportion of our daily life, we go to the toilet, and it is a disinhibition that initiates voiding. We stand at the toilet, our environment is fine, all is quiet, we have a urinal in front of us, we have taken our underwear out of the way. Disinhibition, switch off the control. And this is where detrusor overactivity comes into it. Bladder contractions during the storage phase, which may be spontaneous or provoked. But that, as Werner eloquently put it, is not the whole story. Because it's not just bladder dysfunction. that can counteract urine storage, other dysfunctions can likewise do so. And it is abnormal lower urinary tract muscle behavior that constitutes our profound problem. Urethral relaxation, detrusor overactivity, or the kicking in of the voiding reflex inappropriately. So here, our brain function is actually slightly different, because our brain is preventing detrusor overactivity. So if you lose your brain function, you will get detrusor overactivity. And this, I think, constitutes two gatekeepers. And until we fully understand these gatekeepers, we will be tinkering at the margins of this difficult problem. The first gatekeeper is where the subconscious sensory information becomes conscious sensation. And we can interpret all pathophysiology as to how it might influence either that transition or the transition to inappropriate counter-storage muscle activity. And that's how we should interpret all pathophysiology publications and basic science. Do they alter sensation? Do they alter muscle function? So in answer to we need a brain for overactive bladder, well, we do. It is a conscious sensation. It is also, though, the seat of volition and therefore prevents overactivity. So swings and roundabouts, keep your brain if you want to have OAB but a stable detrusor. Thank you.